Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. And now we begin to see the good fruits reaped by Christendom from the disastrous Battle of Pavia. It came just in time to counteract the machinations of Charles with the French monarch. The defeat of Francis on that field, and the dreary imprisonment in Madrid that followed it, planted rivalries and dislikes between the two powerful crowns of France and Spain, which kept apart two forces that, if united, would have crushed the Reformation. Inspired by hatred and dread of the Emperor Charles, not only had the insinuations of his ambassador the less power with Francis, but he cast his eyes round if haply he might discover allies by whose help he might be able to withstand his powerful rival on the other side of the Pyrenees. Francis resolved on making advances to the Protestant princes of Germany. He was all the more strengthened in this design by the circumstance that these princes, who saw a tempest gathering, had just formed themselves into a league of defense. In March 1531, the representatives of the Protestant states met at Schmalkald, in the electorate of Hesse, and, as we have elsewhere related, 9 princes and 11 cities entered into an alliance for 6 years, to resist all who should try to constrain them to forsake the Word of God and the truth of Christ. The smallest of all the political parties in Christendom, the position of the Schmalkalders gave them an influence far beyond their numbers. They stood between the two mighty states of France and Spain. The balance of power was in their hands, and so far at least, they could play off the crowns of Spain and France against one another. Accordingly, next year Francis sent an ambassador. It was his second attempt to negotiate an alliance with them. His first ambassador was a fool. His second was a wise man, Du Bellay, brother to the Archbishop of Paris, other than whom there was no more accomplished man in all France. Du Bellay did what diplomats only sometimes do, brought heart as well as head to his mission, for he wished nothing so much as to see his master and his kingdom of France cast off the Pope, and displaying their colors alongside those of Protestant Germany, sail away on the rising tide of Protestantism. Du Bellay told the princes that he had his master's express command to offer them his assistance in their great enterprise, and was empowered to arrange with them about the share of the war expenses which his Majesty was ready to pay. This latter proposal revealed the cloven foot. What was uppermost in the mind of the King of France was to avenge the defeat at Pavia, hence his eagerness for war. The League of Schmalkald bound the German princes to stand on the defensive only. They were not to strike unless Charles or some other should first strike at them. Luther raised his powerful voice against the proposed alliance. He hated political entanglements, mistrusted Francis, had a just horror of spilling blood, and he protested with all his might that the Protestants must rest the triumph of their cause on spiritual and not on carnal weapons, that the gospel was not to be advanced by battles, and that the Almighty did not need that the princes of the earth should vote him supports in order to the effectual completion of his all-wise and divine plan. The issue was that the stipulation which Du Bellay carried back to France could not serve the purpose of his master. Repulsed on the side of Germany, the King of France turned now to England. This was a quarter in which he was more likely to succeed. Here he had but one man to deal with, Henry VIII. To Henry, Protestantism was a policy merely, not a faith. He had been crossed in his matrimonial prospects by the Pope, and so had his special quarrel with Clement VII, as Francis had his with Charles V. The French king sent a messenger across the Channel to feel the pulse of his good brother of England, and the result was that an interview was arranged between the two sovereigns, Henry crossing the sea with a brilliant retinue, and Francis coming to meet him with a train not less courtly, taking up their quarters at the abbot's palace at Boulogne, October 1532, the two monarchs confided to each other their grievances and displeasures, and concerted together with a joint plan for humiliating those against whom they bore a common grudge. While Francis and Henry were closeted for hours on end, amusement was found for their courtiers. Balls, masquerades, and other pastimes common in that age occupied that gay assemblage, and helped to conceal the real business which was proceeding all the while in the royal closet. That business eventually found issue in a league between the kings of France and England, in which they engaged to raise an army of 50,000 men, ostensibly to attack the Turk, but in reality to begin a campaign against the emperor and the Pope. Now, thought Francis, I shall wipe out the disgrace of Pavia, and I, said Henry, shall chastise the insolence of Clement. But both were doomed to disappointment. This league, which looked so big and promised so much, came to nothing. Had this great army been assembled, it would have shed much blood, but it would have enlightened no consciences, nor won any victories for truth. Though it might have humbled the Pope, it would have left the papacy as strong as ever. While Francis I was looking so anxiously around him for allies, and deeming it a point of wisdom to lean on the monarch who could bring the largest army into the field, there was one power, the strength of which he missed seeing. The power had neither fleets nor armies at its service, and so Francis shunned rather than courted its alliance. It was fated, in his opinion, to go to the abyss, and should he be so important as to link his cause with it, it would drag him down to the same destruction with itself. This was a natural but, for Francis, a tremendous mistake. The invisible forces are ever the strongest, and these were all on the side of Protestantism. But it is the eye of faith only that can see these. Francis looked with the eye of sense and could see nothing, and therefore stood aloof from a cause which, as it seemed to him, had so few friends, and so many and so powerful enemies. Francis and France lost more than Protestantism did. Chapter 11. The Gospel Preached in Paris. A Martyr. Margaret of Navarre. Her hopes. Resolves to have the Gospel preached in France. The city churches not to be had. Opens a private chapel in the Louvre. A large and brilliant assembly convenes. The preachers. Paris penitent and reforming. Agitation in the Sorbonne. The Sorbonnists apply to the king. The monks occupy the pulpits. They threaten the king. Beta banished. Excitement in Paris. The populace remain with Rome. The crisis of France. The Dominican friar, Laurent de la Croix. His conversion. Preaches in France. Apprehended and conducted to Paris. His torture. His condemnation. His behavior at the stake. France makes her choice. She will abide with Rome. Leaving princes to intrigue for their own ends means under cover of advancing religion. Let us turn to the work itself and mark how it advances by means of instrumentalities far different from those which kings know to employ. This brings before us once more a lady illustrious for her rank, and not less illustrious for her piety, Margaret, the sister of the king, and now Queen of Navarre. She saw her brother holding out his hand to the Protestants of Germany and the King of England, and permitted herself to believe that the hour had at last come when Francis and his kingdom would place themselves on the path of the Reform, and that in the martyrdom of Birken, which had filled her soul with so profound a sorrow, she had seen the last blood that would ever be spilt on the soil of France, and the last stake that would ever blaze in the Place de Grève for the cause of the gospel. Full of these hopes, her zeal and courage grew stronger every day. Reflecting that she stood near the throne, the thousands in all parts of Reformed Christendom looked to her to stand between the oppressor and his victim, and that it became her to avert, as far as was in her power, the guilt of innocent blood from her house and the throne of her brother. She girded herself for the part which it became her to act. The gospel, said this princess, shall be preached in France, in the very capital, nay, in the very bosom of the Roman Catholic Church. The moment was opportune. The carnival of 1533 was just ended. Balls and banquets had for weeks kept the court in a whirl, and Paris in a continual excitement, and wearied with this Saturnalia, Francis had gone to Picardy for repose. Margaret thus was mistress of the situation. She summoned Rossel to her presence, and told him that he must proclaim the great tidings to the population of Paris from its pulpits. The timid evangelist shook like aspen when this command was laid upon him. He remonstrated. He painted the immense danger. He acknowledged that it was right that the gospel should be preached, but he was not the man. Let Margaret find some more intrepid evangelists. The queen, however, persisted. She issued her orders that the churches of Paris should be opened to Russell. But she had reckoned without her host. The Sorbonne lifted its haughty head and commanded that the doors of the churches should be kept closed. The queen and the Sorbonne were now in conflict, but the latter carried the day. The Sorbonnists could be compared only to some of old, who professed to be the doorkeepers of the kingdom of heaven, but would neither go in themselves nor permit those that would to enter. Margaret now contemplated an expedient which enabled her to turn the flank of the doctors. She was resolved to have the gospel preached in the capital of France, and to have it preached now. It might be the turning point of its destiny, and surely it was a likelier way to establish the reform than that of diplomatists who are seeking to do it by leagues and battles. If the Sorbonnists were masters in the city, Margaret was mistress in the palace. She accordingly extemporized a chapel in the Louvre, and told Russell that he must preach in it. This was a less formidable task than holding forth in the city pulpits. The Queen publicly announced that each day at a certain hour a sermon would be preached under the royal roof, and that all would be welcome from peer downwards. The Parisians opened their eyes in wonder. Here was something till now unheard of. The king's palace turned into a Lutheran conventicle. When the hour came, a crowd of all ranks was seen streaming in at the gates of the Louvre, climbing its staircase and pressing on through the antechambers to the saloon where, around Russell, sat the King and Queen of Navarre, and many of the grandees of France. The preacher offered a short prayer, and then read a portion of the Scripture, which he expounded with clearness and great impressiveness. The result bore testimony to the wisdom of Russell and the power of the truth. A direct assault on the papacy would but have excited the combative faculties of his hearers. The exposition of the truth awakened their consciences. Every day saw a greater crowd gathering in the chapel. The saloon could no longer contain the numbers that came. The antechambers and corridors had to be thrown open to give enlarged space to the multitude. The assembly was as brilliant as it was numerous. Nobles, lawyers, men of letters, and wealthy merchants were mingled in the stream of the middle class and artisans that each day, at the appointed hour, flowed in at the royal gates, and devoutly listened under the gorgeous roof of the Louvre to preaching so unwonted. Verily, he would have been a despondent man who, at that hour, would have doubted the triumph of the good cause in France. Margaret, emboldened by the success which had attended her experiment, returned to her first idea, which was to get possession of the churches, turn out the monks, and for their ribald harangues substitute the pure gospel. She wrote to a brother who was still absent, and perhaps not ill-pleased to be so, making request to have the churches placed at her disposal. Francis granted her wish, to the extent of permitting her the use of 2 of the city churches. He was willing to do Protestantism this service, being shrewd enough to see that his negotiations with English and German Protestants would speed none the worse, and that it might equally serve his purpose to terrify the Pope by the possible instant defection of France from its obedience to the Holy See. One of the churches was situated in the quarter of St. Denis, and Margaret sent the Augustine monk Curault to occupy it, around whom there daily assembled a large and deeply impressed congregation gathered from the district. Berthaud, also an Augustine, occupied the pulpit of the other church put by Francis at Margaret's disposal. A fountain of living water had the Queen of Navarre opened in this high place. Inexpressible delight filled her soul as she thought that soon this refreshing stream would overflow all France, and convert the parched and weary land into a very garden. It was the season of Easter, and never had like this been kept in Paris. The city, which so lately had rung from one end to the other with the wild joy and guilty mirth of the carnival, was now not only penitent, but evangelical. The churches were filled, says the historian Crespin, not with formal auditors, but with men who received the glad tidings with great joy. Drunkards had become sober, the idle industrious, the disorderly peaceful, and libertines had grown chaste. 3 centuries and more have rolled over Paris since then. Often in the course of that time has the city been moved, excited, stricken, but never in such sort as now. The same spirit which, in the days of Noah's preaching, strove with the antediluvians, then shut up as in a prison, under the doom of the coming deluge, unless they repented, was manifestly striving at that hour with the men of Paris and of France, shut up as in a prison under a sentence which doomed them unless they escaped by the door that Protestantism opened to them, to sink beneath the fiery billows of war and revolution. What, meanwhile, were the doctors of the Sorbonne about? They were standing by with shut mouths and folded arms, quietly looking on when, as it must have seemed to them, the bark of Peter was drifting to destruction. Did they slumber on their watchtower, not caring that France was becoming Lutheran? Far from it. They gave a few days to the hearing of the report of their spies, and then they raised the alarm. A flood of heresy, like the flood of waters that drowned the old world, was breaking in on France. They must stop it, but with what? The stake. Let us burn Russell, said the fiery Beta, as we burned Birken. The king was applied to for permission, for powerful as was the Sorbonne, it hardly dared drag the preacher from the Queen of Navarre's side without a warrant from Francis. The king would interfere neither for nor against. They applied to the chancellor. The chancellor referred them to the Archbishop du Bellay. He too refused to move. There remained a fourth party to whom they now resolved to carry their appeal: the populace. If they could carry the population of Paris with them, they should yet be able to save Rome. With this object, an agitation was commenced, in which every priest and monk had to bear his part. They sent their preachers into the pulpits, shouting and gesticulating. These men awoke now the anger, now the horror of their fanatical hearers, by the odious epithets and terrible denunciations which they hurled against Lutheranism. They poured a host of mendicants into the houses of the citizens. These, as instructed beforehand, while they filled their wallets, dropped seditious hints that the Pope was above the king, adding that, if matters went on as they were doing, the crown would not long adorn the head of Francis. Still further to move the people against the Queen's preachers, processions were organized in the streets. For 9 days a crowd of penitents, with sackcloth on their loins and ashes on their heads, were seen prostrate round the statue of St. James, loudly imploring the good saint to stretch out his staff, and therewith smite to the dust the hydra that was lifting up its abhorred head in France. Nor did the doctors of the Sorbonne agitate in vain. The excitable populace were catching fire. Fanatical crowds, uttering revolutionary cries, paraded the streets, and the Queen of Navarre and her Protestant coadjutors, seeing the matter growing serious, sent to tell the king the state of the capital. The issue, in the first instance, was a heavy blow to the agitators. The king's pride had been touched by the attack which the Romanists had made on the prerogative, and he ordered that Beda, and the more inflammatory spirits who followed him, should be sent into banishment. It was a trial of strength, not so much between evangelism and Romanism as between the court and the university, and the Sorbonne had to bow its proud head. But the departure of Beda did not extinguish the agitation. The fire he kindled continued to burn after he was gone. Not in a day were the ignorance and fanaticism, which had been ages a-growing, to be extirpated. Fire placards were posted on the houses. Ribald ballads were sung in the streets. To the stake, to the stake, the fire is their home. As God hath commanded, let justice be done, was the refrain of one of these unpolished but cruel productions. Disputations, plots, and rumors kept the city in a perpetual ferment. The Sorbonnists held daily councils, leaving no stone unturned. They worked upon the minds of the leading members of the Parliament of Paris, and by dint of persistency and union, they managed to rally to their standard all the ignorant, the fanatical, and the selfish, that is, the bulk of the population of the capital. The Protestant sermons were continued for some time. Many conversations took place, but the masses remained on the side of Rome. This was the crisis of France, the day of its special visitation. More easily than ever before or since might France have freed its soul from the yoke of Rome, and secured for all coming time the glorious heritage of Protestant truth and liberty. This was, in fact, a second day of visitation. The first had occurred under Lefebvre and Farel. That day had passed, and the golden opportunity that came with it had been lost. A second now returned, for there in the midst of Paris were the feet of them that publish peace, and that preach the opening of the prison to them that are bound. What an auspicious and blessed achievement if Margaret had been able to win the population of Paris to the gospel. Paris won, France would have followed. It needed but this to crown its many happy qualities, and make France one of the most delightful lands on earth, a land full of all terrestrial good things, ennobled, moreover, by genius, and great in art as in arms. But Paris was deaf, as adder to the voice of the charmer. And from that hour the destiny of France was changed. A future of countless blessings was fatally transformed into a future of countless woes. We behold woe on woe rising, with the rising centuries. We had almost said with the rising years. But for a moment its sun looks forth. Lo, there comes another tempest from the abyss, black as night, and bearing on its wings a fiery shower to scorch the miserable land. The St. Bartholomew massacre and civil wars of the 16th century, the dragonnades of the 17th, the revolution of the 18th, and the communism of the 19th are but the more notable outbursts of that revolving storm which for 300 years has darkened the heavens and devastated the land of France. Paris had made its choice, and as in old time when men joined hands and entered into covenant, they ratified the transaction by sacrifice. Paris sealed its engagement to abide by the Pope in the blood of a disciple of the gospel. Had the Sorbonne been more completely mastered the situation, Russell would have been selected as a sacrifice, but he was too powerfully protected to permit the priests venturing on burning him, and a humbler victim had to be found. A Dominican friar, known by the name of Laurent de la Croix, had come to the knowledge of the gospel in Paris. Straightway he threw off his cowl and cloak and monkish name, and fled to Geneva, where Farel received him, and more perfectly instructed him in the Reformed doctrines. To the great natural eloquence he now added a clear knowledge and a burning zeal. Silent he could not remain, and Switzerland was the first scene of his evangelizing efforts. But the condition of poor France began to lie heavy on his heart, and though he well knew the perils he must brave, he could not restrain his yearnings to return and preach to his countrymen that Savior so dear to himself. Crossing the frontier and taking the name of Alexander, he made his way to Lyon. Already Protestantism had its disciples in the city of Peter Waldo, and these gave a warm welcome to the evangelist. He began to preach, and his power to move the hearts of men was marvelous. In Lyon, the scene of Irenaeus' ministry, and the seat of a church whose martyrs were amongst the most renowned of the primitive age, it seemed as if the gospel, which here had lain 1,000 years in its sepulchre, were rising from the dead. Alexander preached every day, this hour in one quarter of the city, and the next in the opposite. It began to be manifest that some mysterious influence was acting on the population. The agents of the priests were employed to scent it out, but it seemed as if the preacher, whoever he was, to his other qualities added that of invisibility. His pursuers in every case arrived to find the sermon ended and the preacher gone, they knew not whither. His success in baffling pursuit made his friends in time less careful. Alexander was apprehended, escorted by bowmen, and loaded with chains. He was sent to Paris. The guards soon saw that the prisoner they had in charge was like no other that had ever before been committed to their keeping. Before Paris was reached, the captain of the company, as well as several of its members, had, as a result of their prisoner's conversation with them, become converts to the gospel. As he pursued his journey in bonds, Alexander preached at the inns and villages where they halted for the night. At every stage of the way he left behind him trophies of the Protestant faith. The prisoner was comforted by the thought that his master had turned the road to the stake into a missionary progress, and if in a few days he should breathe his last amid the flames, others would rise from his ashes to confess the truth when he could no longer preach it. Arrived in Paris, he was brought before the Parliament. The prisoner meekly yet courageously confessed the Reformed faith. He was first cruelly tortured, putting his limbs in the boot. The executioners drove in the wedges with such blows that his left leg was crushed. Alexander groaned aloud. "O God," he exclaimed, says Crespin, "there is neither pity nor mercy in these men. Oh, that they might find both in thee." "Another blow," said the head executioner. The martyr, seeing Budæus among the assessors, and turning on him a look of supplication, said, "Is there no Gamaliel here to moderate the cruelty they are practicing on me?" Budæus, great in the schools, but irresolute in the matters of the gospel, fixing an eye on the piety of Alexander, said, "It is enough. His torture is too much. Forbear." His words took effect. The executioner, says Crespin, lifted up the martyr and carried him to his dungeon, a cripple. He was condemned to be burned alive. In the hope of daunting him, his sentence, contrary to the then usual practice, was pronounced in his presence. But they who watched his face, instead of fear, saw a gleam of joy shoot at the instant athwart it. He was next made to undergo the ceremony of degradation. They shaved his crown, scraped his fingertips, and tore off his robe. "If you speak a word," said they, "we will cut out your tongue." For about this time, according to the historian Crespin, this horrible barbarity began to be practiced upon the confessors of the truth. Last of all, they brought forth the robe de fall. When Alexander saw himself about to be arrayed in this dress, he could not, says Crespin, refrain from speaking. "O God," said he, "is there any higher honor than to receive the livery which the Son received in the house of Herod?" The martyr was now attired for the fire. Unable to walk to the place of execution, for one of his legs had been sorely mangled in the boot, they provided a cart, one usually employed to convey away rubbish, and placed the martyr in it. As he passed along from the concierge to the place Maubert, he managed to stand up, and resting his hands on the sides of the cart and leaning over, he preached to the crowds that thronged the streets, commending them to the Savior for whom he was about to die, and exhorting them to flee from the wrath to come. The smile which his sentence had kindled on his face had not yet gone off of it. Nay, it appeared to glow and brighten the nearer he drew to the stake. "He is going to be burned," said the onlookers, "and yet no one seems as happy as he." Being come to the place of execution, they lifted him out of the cart, placing him against the stake, and bound him to it with chains. He begged, before they should kindle the pile, that he might be permitted to say a few more last words to the people. Leave was given, and breaking into an ecstasy, he again extolled the Savior for whom he was now to lay down his life, and again commended him to those around. The executioners, as they waited to do their office, gazed with mingled wonder and fear on this strange criminal. The spectators, among whom was a goodly number of monks, said, "Surely there is nothing worthy of death in this man," and smiting on their breasts, and bewailing his fate with plenteous tears, exclaimed, "If this man is not saved, who of the sons of men can be so?" Well might the martyr, as he saw them weeping, have said, "Weep not for me, but weep for yourselves." A few sharp pangs, and to him would come joy forever. But for them, alas, and for their children, the cry of the blood of the martyr, and of 1,000s more yet to be slain, was to be answered in a future dark with woe. Now that we find ourselves 300 years from these events, and can look back on all that has come and gone in Paris since, we can clearly see that the year 1533 was one of the grand turning points in the history of France. Between the stake of Birken and the stake of Alexander, There were 3 full years during which the winds of persecution were held back. During at least 2 of these years, the gospel was freely and faithfully preached in the capital, and influence from on high was plainly at work amongst the people. 5,000 men and women daily passed in at the gates of the Louvre to listen to Russell, and numerous churches throughout the city were opened and filled with crowds that seemed to thirst for that water of life. Many felt the powers of the world to come. In these events, Providence put it distinctly, "Ye this day whom ye shall serve. Will you abide by the papacy, or will you cast in your lot with the Reformation?" And the men of Paris as distinctly replied, when a period of probation had come to an end, "We will abide by the Pope." The choice of Paris was the choice of France. Scarcely were the flames of Alexander's pile extinguished when the sky of that country, which was kindling apace, as the friends of truth fondly thought, with the glories of the opening day, became suddenly overcast, and the clouds of threatening blackness began to gather. In the spring of 1534, the churches of Paris were closed. The sermons were suppressed. 300 Lutherans were swept off to prison, and soon thereafter the burning were resumed. But the ominous circumstance was that the persecutor was backed by the populace. Queen Margaret's attempt to win over the population of the capital to the gospel had proved a failure, and the consequence was that the Sorbonne, with the help of the popular suffrage, again set up the stake, and from that day to this, the masses in France have been on the side of Rome. Chapter 12. Calvin's Flight from Paris. Out of Paris comes the Reformer. The contrasts of history. Calvin's interview with the Queen of Navarre. Nicholas Cop, rector of the Sorbonne. An inaugural discourse. Calvin writes and Cop delivers it. The gospel in disguise. Rage of the Sorbonne. Cop flies to Basel. The officers on their way to arrest Calvin. Calvin is let down by the window. Escapes from Paris disguised as a vine dresser. Arrives in Angoulême. Received at the mansion of du Tillet. Here projects the Institutes. Interview with Lefebvre. Lefebvre's prediction. Pepin of France was the first of the Gothic princes to appear before the throne of St. Peter and lay his kingdom at the feet of the Pope. As a reward for this act of submission, the Holy Father bestowed upon him the proud title, for so have the kings of France accounted it, of eldest son of the Church. Throughout the 13th century, since and amid much change of fortune, France has striven to justify the distinction she bears by being the firmest pillar of the Papal See. But, as de Bigny has observed, if Paris gave Pepin to the popedom, it is not less true that Paris gave Calvin to the Reformation. This is the fact. Although Calvin was not born in Paris, the little Noyon in Picardy had this honor, or disgrace, as it accounted it. But if Noyon was the scene of Calvin's first birth, Paris was the scene of his second birth, and it was the latter that made him a reformer. In estimating the influence of the two men, the pen of Calvin may well be thrown into the scale against the sword of Pepin. As the cradle of Moses was placed by the side of the throne of Pharaoh, the Church's great oppressor, so the cradle of the second Moses was placed by the side of the chair of Pepin, the eldest son of the Church, and the first of those vassal kings who stood round the papal throne, and from the court of France, as Moses from the court of Egypt, Calvin went forth to rend the fetters of his brethren, and ring the knell of their oppressor's power. The contrasts and resemblances of history are instructive as well as striking. They shed a beautiful light upon the providence of God. They show us that the great ruler has fixed a time and a place for every event and for every man, that he sets the good over against the evil, maintaining a nice and equitable poise among events, and that while the laws of his workings are eternal, the results are inexpressibly varied. We have seen Calvin return to Paris in 1529. He was present in that city during those 4 eventful years when the novel and stirring scenes we have narrated were taking place. How was he occupied? He felt that to him the day of labor had not yet fully arrived. He must prepare against its approach by reading, by study, and by prayer. In the noisy combats with which the saloons, the halls of the Sorbonne, and even the very streets were then resounding, Calvin cared but little to mingle. His ambition was to win victories which, if less ostentatious, would be far more durable. Like his old teacher, Mathurin Cordier, so wise in his honesty, he wished solidly to lay the foundations, and was not content to rear structures which were sure to topple over with the first breeze. He desired to baptize men for the stake, to make converts who would endure the fire. Eschewing the knots of disputants on the streets, he entered the abodes of the citizens, and winning attention by his very shyness, as well as by the clearness and sweetness of his discourse, he talked with the family on the things that belonged to their peace. He had converted a soul, while his friends outside had but demolished a syllogism. Calvin was the pioneer of all those who, since his day, have labored in the work of the recovery of the lapsed masses. However, the fame he shunned, and the more he fled from it, did but the more pursue him. His name was mentioned in the presence of the Queen of Navarre. Margaret must needs see the young evangelist. We tremble as we see Calvin enter the Louvre to be presented at court. They who are in kings' houses wear soft raiment, and learn to pursue middle courses. If Calvin is to be all to the church, he must be nothing to kings and queens. All the more do we tremble at the ordeal he is about to undergo when we reflect that, in combination with his sternness of principle and uprightness of aim, there are in Calvin a tenderness of heart and a yearning, not for praise, but for sympathy, which may render him susceptible to the blandishments and flatteries of a court. But God went with him to the palace. Calvin's insight discovered even then what afterwards became manifest to less penetrating observers, that, while Margaret's piety was genuine, it was clouded nevertheless by mysticism, and her opinions, though sound in the main, were too hesitating and halting to compass a full reformation of the Church. On these accounts he was unable to fully identify himself with the cause of the Queen of Navarre. Nevertheless, there were not a few points of similarity between the two which excited a mutual admiration. There was in both a beautiful genius. There was in both a lofty soul. There was in both a love of what is pure and noble, and especially there was in both what is the beginning and end of all piety, a deep heaven-begotten reverence and love of the Savior. Margaret did not conceal her admiration of the young scholar and evangelist. His eyes so steadfast, yet so keen, his features so calm, yet so expressive of energy, the wisdom of his utterances, and the air of serene strength that breathed around him, betokening a power within, which, though enshrined in a somewhat slender frame, was evidently awaiting a future of great achievements, won the confidence of the Queen. Calvin was in a fair way of becoming a frequent visitor at the palace, when an unexpected event drove the young scholar from Paris and averted the danger, if ever it had existed, of the chief reformer of Christendom becoming lost in the court chaplain. That event fell out. Nicholas Kopp, rector of the Sorbonne, was the intimate friend of Calvin. It was October 1533, and the session of the university was to open on the 1st of next month, All Saints' Day, when Kopp was expected to grace the occasion with an inaugural discourse. What an opportunity, thought Calvin, of having the gospel preached in the most public of all the pulpits of Christendom. He waited on his friend Kopp and broke to him his stratagem. But Kopp felt unequal to the task of composing such an address as would answer the end. It was finally agreed between the two friends that Calvin should write and that Kopp should read the oration. It was a bold experiment, full of grave risks, of which its devisers were not unaware, but they had made up their minds to the dangerous venture. The 1st of November arrived. It was a brilliant assembly in the church of the Mathurins, professors, students, the elite of the learned men of Paris, a goodly muster of Franciscans, some of whom more than half suspected Kopp of a weakness for Lutheranism, and a sprinkling of the friends of the new opinions who had had a hint of what was to happen. On a bench apart sat Calvin, with the air of one who had dropped in by the way. Kopp rose, and proceeded, amid the deep silence, to pronounce an oration in praise of Christian philosophy. But the philosophy which he extolled was not that which had been drawn from the academies of Greece, but that divine wisdom, to reveal which to man the immortal had put on mortality. The keynote of the discourse was the grace of God, the one sole fountain of man's renewal, pardon, and eternal life. The oration, although Protestant in spirit, was very thoroughly academic. Its noble sentiments were clothed in language clear, simple, yet majestic. Blank astonishment was portrayed on the faces of the most part of the audience at the beginning of the oration. By and by, a countenance here and there began to kindle with delight. Others among the listeners were becoming uneasy on their seats. The monks knit their brows, and shooting out fiery glances from beneath them, exchanged whispers with one another. They saw through the thin disguise in which the rector was trying to veil the gospel. Spoken on All Saints' Day, yet not a word about the saints did the oration contain. It was a desecration of their festival, an act of treason against these glorious intercessors, a blow struck at the foundation of Rome, so they judged, and rightly. The assembly rose, and then the storm burst. Heresy had reached an astounding pitch of audacity when it dared to rear its head in the very midst of the Sorbonne. It must be struck down at once. Kopp was denounced to the Parliament, then the supreme judge and executioner of heretics. Summoned to its bar, he resolved, strong in the integrity of his cause, and presuming not a little on his position as head of the first university in Christendom, to obey the citation. He was already on his way to the Palace of Justice, attired in his robes of office, his beadles and apparitors preceding him, with their maces and gold-headed staves, when a friend, pressing through the crowd, whispered into his ear that he was marching to his death. Kopp saw the danger of prosecuting further this duel between the Parliament and the Sorbonne. He fled to Basel, and so escaped the fate already determined on for him. When Kopp was gone, it began to be rumored that the author of the address, which had set Parliament and the university in flames, was still in Paris, and that he was none other than Calvin. Such a spirit was enough to set all Christendom on fire. He must be burned. Already the lieutenant criminal, Jean Morin, who for some time had had his eye on the young evangelist, was on his way to apprehend him. Calvin, who deemed himself safe in his obscurity, was sitting quietly in his room in the College of Fortret, when some of his comrades came running into the chamber and urged him to flee that instant. Scarcely had they spoken when a loud knocking was heard at the outer gate. It was the officers. Now their heavy tramp was headed in the corridor. Another moment Calvin would be on his way to the concierge, to come out of it only to the stake. That would indeed have been a blow to the Reformation, and probably would have changed the whole future of Christendom. But God interposed at this moment of peril. While some of his friends held a parley with the officers at the door, others, seizing the sheets on his bed, twisted them into a rope, fastened them in a window, and Calvin, catching hold of them, let himself down into the street of the Bernardins. Dropped into the street, the fugitive traversed Paris with rapid steps, and soon reached the suburbs. His first agitation subsiding, he began to think how he could disguise himself, knowing that the officers of Morin would be on his track. Espying a vine-dresser's cottage, and knowing the owner to be friendly to the gospel, he entered, and there arranged the plan of his flight. Doffing his own dress, he put on the coat of a peasant, and with a garden hoe on his shoulder, he set out on his journey. He went forth not knowing where he was going. The pioneer of hundreds of thousands who in later years were to flee from France and to seek under other skies that liberty to confess the gospel which was denied them in their native land. To Calvin, the disappointment must have been as keen as it was sudden. He had fondly hoped that the scene of his conversion would be the scene of his labors also. He saw, too, as he believed, the gospel on the eve of triumphing in France. Was it not preached in the churches of the capital, taught from the chairs of the Sorbonne, and honored in the palace of the monarch? But God had arranged for both France and Calvin a different future from that which the young evangelist pictured to himself. The great kingdom of France was to harden its heart, that God might glorify his power upon it, and Calvin was to go into exile that he might prepare in solitude those great works by which he was to instruct so many nations and speak to the ages of the future. Turning to the south, Calvin went on to Orleans, but he did not stop there. He pursued his way to Tours, but neither did he halt there. Going onward still, he traversed those great plains which the Loire and other streams water, so rich in meadows and tall shade trees, and which are so loved by the vine, forming then as they do at this day the finest part of that country. After some weeks' wandering, he reached Angoulême, the birthplace of Margaret of Navarre. Here he directed his steps to the mansion of the du Tillet, a noble and wealthy family, high in office in the state, famed, moreover, for their love of letters, and with one of those members Calvin had formed an acquaintance in Paris. The exile had not miscalculated. The young du Tillet, the only one of the family then at home, was delighted to resume in Angoulême the intercourse begun in Paris. The noble mansion, with all in it, was at the service of Calvin. Thank you all for taking your time to listen to the history of Protestantism. Please like this recording wherever it is that you are listening to it. And as a special favor, I ask you all to go to crosstheborder.org and click on the cover of the volume that you are listening to, which will take you to the appropriate Amazon page. And please leave a 5-star review there and a brief comment about something that you've heard or read in that volume. Thank you so much for taking that little bit of extra time to support us.